hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I wanted to show you some really incredible games from Norway Chess. Norway Chess, I believe, Ben Simon and I were discussing, is the first, super invitational tournament to be back since the pandemic, playing over the board in-person chess. Of course, there were some high-level players in the Bundesliga, but this is it, 6 of the world's best players all in Norway right now, duking it out on the chessboard. And as you can see from the title, the theme tonight is actually going to be one of defense. Of course, The Art of Attack is a very famous chess book, one of the best chess books of all time, but really what separates today's top players from top players of the past is their ability to defend positions, their ability to have a slightly weak king or a slightly bad position and defend it, make something good out of it, and turn it around and get the full point. So we're going to look at some examples of that here today. To start off, I have a game between Levon Aronian and Aryan Tari. And this is a game I was actually following live. Of course, there is some wonderful commentary being provided by Kramnik, who is like, what better chess player can you ask for commentary, and Judith Polgar as well, another superstar commentator. And I thought they had a lot of interesting thoughts about this game, and in analyzing it afterwards, I actually found that maybe some things were slightly different from what they were saying. So let's jump into it and take a look. We had e4 by Aronian, e5, and we go down the depths of the Roy Lopez theory. a6, back it up, knight f6, castles, bishop b7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3. Not super interested in getting into a huge opening discussion here, but Aryan Tari chooses the martial gambit, or martial attack, however you want to call it. I think it's called the martial attack, not the gambit. But either way, it is a gambit of a pawn by black. Black breaks in the center with d5. White can capture this pawn, but now, unfortunately for black, this e-pawn has been left behind with the activation of white's rook here on e1. Black takes back on e5. White captures on e5. We see c6 by black, securing this knight on the d5 square. And then the normal moves here are d4 and d3, and that's about as deep as my theoretical knowledge on the martial goes. But Levon Aronian actually chose a bit of a sideline, the third most popular move of rook e1, just removing this rook from any kind of threats, any potential tactics on e5. Of course, white is anticipating a bishop coming to d6 with pressure on the king side, and so now this move just won't come with tempo. So bishop d6 is actually played anyways. White can now transpose to the main stuff by playing d4 or d3, but Levon Aronian chooses g3 instead. And already, the defensive task for white has begun. I'm sure we are still well within both players' prep here, but I want to highlight a bit what exactly Levon Aronian is doing. So of course, in the martial attack, white is a pawn to the good, but in exchange, black is getting very, very rapid development and is able to create some nasty threats on the white king side, thanks to all of his pieces, minor pieces and queen, sort of bearing down on this half of the board. So what is Levon doing right off the bat? Well, he's setting up a strong color complex, and this is sort of an idea that can show up in many, many different positions. Levon is going to make his stand on the dark squares. So why the dark squares? Well, for one, he's able to limit this dark squared bishop pretty effectively by playing g3, but in addition to that, he's also limiting this knight. This knight is no longer going to freely hop around into the king side. Compare this if Levon played a horrible move like h3. With h3, you might think a lot of the same things are being accomplished, right? We are sort of negating this bishop by removing its target from the h2 square. We're even preventing this bishop from hopping into some dangerous squares, and we're not making all those light squared weaknesses around the king. However, I do think this move is pretty substantially worse. Now there is always going to be a knight f4 hop to worry about. The queen can come to h4, and black is going to be very happy to sacrifice this bishop at some correct moment and just play for the win on the king side. So dark squares are the squares that Levon chooses to fight for in this case, because it negates both of these minor pieces by black. A really cool defensive idea. Aryan Tari continues his development with the move bishop f5, and Levon finally pushes the d-pawn out to d4 in this case. Now we see an interesting move by Aryan Tari. The theoretical move is apparently queen to d7, getting behind this bishop, and play might continue something like this, black just getting the remaining pieces into play, and going for some kind of attack on these light squares, forcing this queen even further away from the king over to the queen side. In the game, though, Aryan Tari goes for queen f6 with some slightly different ideas. And this isn't, a novelty, technically. I think this has been played once or twice before, but it is a perfectly reasonable move by black, bringing the queen into the attack, connecting the rooks, and preparing for the future. Now, how do you guys think Levon should continue in this position? I want you guys to try and come up with some kind of line, some kind of defensive variation for Levon. And when I say that, I mean try to find a plan for these three pieces. These three pieces remain undeveloped, and you sort of need to figure out how you can best place them to defend the king and try and consolidate your position. So take a few minutes here, or I'm not going to wait a few minutes, take a few moments. If you want to take a few minutes, go ahead and pause the video and try to figure out where these pieces really belong in order to keep white safe. What should Levon be doing here? Also, hello to everyone in the chat. Thank you all for joining me tonight. Hello to Chess King, Bobbert Collins, Dan Thorson, Mateo rather. Hello. Chess King likes the move bishop c2, which is a pretty interesting idea. Trying to get rid of the light squared bishop, and his reasoning is that the light squares are weak, and so he's trying to bring this guy back into play, or at least get rid of the light squared bishop. Any other ideas in the chat? Hello to Aryan. Aryan, we are looking at a game by your namesake here, Aryan Tari. Okay, someone has said bishop g4. I'm not sure I understand. That is the g4 square. It's difficult for white to play bishop g4. Queen f3 is an idea, says Chess King once again. And so I'm going to be asking you guys to be thinking rather far ahead here. So there's one very specific reason why I don't like the move bishop c2. And that reason is this bishop is actually potentially going to serve an important defensive role from the f3 square. Number one, it's offering some chances for counterplay by pressuring this knight on d5. And number two, it is actually going to be relevant that this bishop is eyeing this king from a distance. Why is that? Well, it will become very, very clear a little bit later on. But one reason is that a very powerful idea for black to try and break down white's defensive blockade on the dark squares is potentially to push this f-pawn forward, activating this rook on f8, and chopping on the g3 square to sort of break down this blockade. And obviously, if this f-pawn were to move, then this bishop would be looking very, very nice on the b3 square, forcing almost black to spend an extra tempo to remove the king from these kinds of threats. So, all of that is to say, we're not so interested in moving this bishop that we've already developed when it could very well serve a useful purpose on b3. This bishop is already in the game, already developed. It's already pressuring one of black's potential attackers and indirectly the black king. So it is actually pretty technically wrong to be moving this bishop right now. As for these pieces, well, obviously you can't really come to f4, you can't really come to g5, and so the move bishop e3 should definitely be on your mind for white, and this is what Levon starts with. As for coming up with a plan, well, I think it's pretty clear that this knight should reroute over to the king side in some manner. Well, whether this knight comes to f1, f3, or maybe even e4, a little bit more of an advanced square for the knight, pressuring the black pieces, is still unclear, but at the very least, we can get these pieces out with bishop e3, knight d2, and then Chess King's idea of queen f3 is going to be very, very important here. So how did this take place in the game? Well, Levon, simple enough for him, just plays bishop e3, black tries queen g6, and now we do see knight d2. Now, bishop g4, I think, would be playable immediately, but white would be potentially happy to go queen c2 and queen h5. And now white is successfully sort of taking over this e4 square, and black is going to have to shuffle back and forth a little bit. So instead we see black play the preparatory move, rook a to e8, taking a little bit more control over this e4 square before trying to take over and go for these checkmating ideas on g2. Now, how to continue? Well, Levon plays the third move we were discussing, queen f3, just bringing the queen to the defense of the king. How does the game continue now? Well, Aryan Tari plays very naturally, playing bishop g4, forcing this queen now to a rather awkward square, either g2 or h1. Queen g2 is Levon's choice. And now we see queen h5. And now I would like you guys to stop and think about what white should do from this position. White has sort of achieved many of his opening goals. He's gotten all of his pieces off the back row. You could argue that they are actually fully developed, in fact. And now Levon needs to make some decisions about how to handle this middle game. So what ideas are coming to mind for you? What ideas spring to mind here? And yeah, the chat is actually mentioning some interesting routes for this knight, including potentially coming to the f3 square to try and break down this knight. And again, this is another reason why it's so nice to have this bishop here on b3 for the moment. Not to say we're never going to bring it back to c2 or d1, but for the moment it does provide some nice pressure on d5. And keep this idea in mind, because it might actually show up a little bit later in the game. So there is one key move in the martial attack for white that everybody should hopefully be familiar with. Right now, white is defending the king with a number of pieces, but this rook sitting here on a1 is, quite a sorry piece. And in fact, this is the one piece white can really effectively use to get meaningful counterplay, especially after the move rook a to e8. So of course, the move for counterplay, the natural move in the martial that you should be familiar with if you play this opening, is the move a4. And so how is this related to defending the white king, right? We're talking about the art of defense in this lecture. So what does a4 have to do with anything? Well, a4 is how white achieves counterplay in this opening, and that's why this move is so critical. Whenever you're playing, defensively, whenever you're on the back foot, that does not mean you have to play entirely passively. One very effective way of defending is by attacking. If your opponent is dealing with threats on the other side of the board, you may be able to distract some of these attacking pieces or gain more material, gain more advantages on that other side of the board, which will, of course, distract from the fact that you have to defend your king a little bit, or your position might be a little bit weak on the other side. So I think a4 would be a great move here. But Levon actually holds off on playing a4. He plays another move, which was rather controversial on the broadcast. This is about where I was tuning in, listening to, of course, the incredible players Vladimir Kremnik and Judith Polgar. And they had a lot to say about Levon's next move. So what does Levon play? Levon plays the move h4, which is a very, very interesting idea. Of course, the main point in this move is that it is gaining control, albeit temporarily, of the h3 square. Why does this matter so much? Well, if you play something like a4, later on in the game you might have to contend with bishop h3, and this queen on h1 is not so happy, and if this queen ever, is completely evicted from the light squares, let's say, a bad move like knight f1 were to be played, then already stuff like bishop f3, and this queen is actually going to be trapped. White has some tactical ideas still in this position, but, the queen being trapped, obviously not ideal, and threats of queen h3 are going to be coming as well. So h4 both gives this queen some space and takes back control of one of these light squares around the white king. Now, can anybody tell me what the obvious downside of the move h4 is? What is the downside here? Because at first glance, it does just seem to technically improve white's position on the king's side, right? It's negating many, many, many of black's threats, but it is not without consequence. So Chess King says it's a bit of a hook, which is one idea that black often has whenever white is pushing a pawn like this in front of the king, but I don't think it's the most relevant one here. If we were to use the h-pawn as a hook, that would involve playing the move g5, which is admittedly rather difficult to manufacture here. Yeah, many people in the chat are saying this idea of g5, but I'm not so sure this is the easiest move to get off. And by the way, g5 may actually be helping white defend. If this h file opens and this queen comes to h1, you might find it's a useful defensive idea for white to be able to trade the queens in many cases, rather than an attacking idea for black. So the other idea being mentioned in the chat is, I think, the more relevant one here, and that is that the g3 pawn is now very, very weak. And so Levon is now going to have to contend with tactics against this g3 pawn for the rest of the game. And this is why Kramnik and Polgar did not have such nice things to say about this move h4. They thought perhaps Levon is taking some risks against Aryan Tari, who wasn't having the best tournament, still isn't, and is the lowest rated player in the field. But on the other hand, maybe Levon has some ideas here. So after this move h4, Aryan Tari actually does find a very, very interesting move here, right? To take advantage of the fact that g3 is slightly weakened. You know, taking on e3 is actually a pretty bad idea because it's a bit too simple, right? For the moment, you're not actually winning anything on g3, and you're sort of giving white the center, and at the same time, you're clarifying the situation for white, which is not really what black is interested in doing. Black is trying to make things more complicated. So Aryan manages to find this really incredible move, bishop e2. And this is a pretty nasty move here. The point is, you just shove this bishop in the way of the rook, and now there is a very serious threat of knight takes e3. Levon's pretty much only move here is to play knight f1, so he does, defending this bishop on e3. And of course, if bishop takes f1 wherever be played, I think king takes f1 is going to be the idea. And everything is still solid here for white. So after knight f1, black comes up with this move, rook to e6. And I think already this is Aryan Tari perhaps playing a bit too loosely in the position. So I think the time is right here for black to try to play the move bishop f3. And the point now is white will either have to go bishop d1 and trade off some pieces. And what do you think black's idea might be if he gets this light squared bishop off the board? Can anybody tell me? Also, by the way, white's only other option here is to sort of go queen h2, which is just not going to be a pleasant move in this case for white. So bishop d1 really should be played. And then can anybody tell me a useful idea for black in this particular position here? And yes, someone in the chat has it. The idea of f5 is going to be quite strong. We removed this bishop for white that was offering counterplay against the black king, and now f5 is another very useful way to attack the dark squares after h4 has been played. And so Levon might be facing a little bit of pressure here as well. I'm not saying he has a bad position by any means, but this would be a useful way for black to sort of find counterplay in the position. Instead of that, though, we see rook e6. And now Levon Aronian comes up with a pretty nice move of bishop d2, right? Black was going to bring this rook to e8 and sort of renew the threats against the bishop on e3. So the simple move, bishop d2, is now preparing to trade some pieces along the e file, as well as introduce ideas of, you guessed it, knight e3 that was being mentioned earlier on in the lecture. Rook fe8 was the follow-up here for black. And now Levon Aronian finally breaks through with a4, the classic idea for counterplay in the Marshall. We do finally see bishop f3. Levon Aronian inserts a trade of rooks. Black is not interested in taking the queen when he would lose two rooks and a bishop for the queen here. So rook takes back on e6, queen h3 for Levon, and then after bishop g4, queen h2 is where Levon puts his queen to avoid a repetition of moves with the bishop moving back and forth. Now Aryan plays this simple move h6, giving the king a flight square, and Levon can finally play AB, AB, and now knight e3. And suddenly, things are beginning to look rather unfortunate for Aryan Tari here. He's very much on the back foot now. You know, at first glance, it looked as though black was the one with all of the play, but now black has to be very, very careful to not be worse in this position. Why is that? Well, we'll see very quickly in the game what happens and how this position can go south at a moment's notice. So who thinks they can find the only move to sort of keep black in the game at this point? Black really only has one move that keeps the game going here. It's really only one idea that works out. It's not the idea of f5. f5 would lose the game, right? f5 was good earlier because we got rid of this bishop on b3. With the bishop still here, I think you might find you are running into some tactical issues on the d5 square. Not f5 here. No, not c5 either. I think c5 is losing this piece, right? Got to be careful. Yeah, bishop f3. Well, you guys are playing like 2633 rated player Aryan Tari, so not too bad. But bishop f3, unfortunately, is not it. Believe it or not, I think black's best try is to actually capture this knight on e3. Why is that? Well, it's because black has total domination over the light squares if this bishop and this knight come off the board. So after bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, bishop takes e3, here black can play for counterplay based solely on the fact that the light squares are totally absent for white. Queen e2 is coming as well, and black is going to have a lot of active play on these light squares and can try to keep the game going a bit. For example, something like queen g2, bishop d5, queen h3, queen b2, and now black is, of course, getting a lot of play against these queenside pawns, and like I said, has enough threats against the white king to sort of stay in the game here. By the way, if queen f1, then I think queen g4 is going to be a good idea. And now white has to be careful not to be worse. For example, if you play some nothing move like this, bishop takes g3 is going to come. And like I said, plenty of threats in the position here for black still remain. So knight takes e3 would have been an interesting idea to sort of keep black in the game with plenty of threats, just removing all of white's pieces that can defend the light squares and then playing for that kind of domination. Instead, though, the move bishop f3 comes on the board, and now, unfortunately for Aryan Tari, Levon Aronian is able to break free on these light squares. How does he do so? Well, now this knight is controlling a very important g4 square and allows for the move queen h3. And now it is just too late for Aryan Tari to stay in the game. White has the active rook on a1. White's queen is going to be able to escape out through f5 or g4. And you know, the threats are sort of dissipating now for Aryan Tari. And at the end of the day, he's just down a pawn. It's tough. In the game, to stop bishop f5, Aryan Tari played bishop e4. And by the way, it's too little too late to try knight takes e3. Now after takes here, there is of course a queen takes with check, and this is going to be a pretty substantial difference in the position. So bishop e4 was tried, but now queen g4, and white has broken free. The queens come off the board, and now it's Levon Aronian's game to win. f5 still comes on the board, but now a very clever move by Levon is the move knight e5. And this is a pretty unusual tactic, actually. I should say this one was one of the more interesting tactics. So can anybody tell me why black can't just simply win a pawn on the e5 square? Why can't black win a pawn? What's wrong with black winning a pawn for free? Free pawn on e5. So not quite f3. f3 is importance, but not to start with. So yeah, believe it or not, after take on e5, which is actually played in the game, and take on e5, which is not played in the game, The move rook e1 is a pin that cannot be broken. It's pretty highly unusual to see, all of these pieces sort of flounder in a situation like this, where there's no way to break the pin with a full tempo for black, but there's just no way to break the pin. Rook e7 is only fake defending this rook, because this king is still on g8, and f3 would win a piece. You cannot go rook e6 and retreat the bishop, because there's simply no retreating squares. There's no way to attack this bishop for a turn. You can't go c5, c4. You're just too late here, because I'm attacking this knight, and even this, and again, there's just nothing to do. And yeah, this would be winning a piece for white. It's a rather unusual tactic. I wanted to highlight this one. But after takes, Aryan Tari is of course strong enough to see those tactics and plays king f8 instead. But now f4, and it is definitely Levon Aronian's game to win now. Rook e7 was played in the game, and Levon Aronian finds a really nice idea, which is to take on d5. If bishop takes d5 were to be played, then there is another tactic here for Levon in c4, when you will be losing the exchange. So c takes d5 must be played, and then it is a highly, highly unusual situation where after a few more moves, bishop e3, rook c7, stopping bishop c5, rook a5, bishop d3, bishop d4 rather, rook c6, king f2, h5, and after h5, believe it or not, white is essentially playing with an extra piece. What do I mean by that? I mean white is going to be trying to win on these three ranks using this pawn, and after the move h5, this bishop cannot legally interact with any of these squares. This bishop is stuck on this half of the board, and usually we don't talk about a piece being entombed when it can move on over half the board, but this bishop is essentially just entombed here, and it's a pretty crazy idea, but white is totally winning because this bishop is essentially not on the board for black. It's a really unique kind of construction here. King e3 was played, bishop c4. Rook a3 was Levon Aronian's idea, with now some threats of going b3. Rook g6 is played, b3 does show up on the board. No time to take this when both of your pieces would be hanging. So bishop f1, this is a check, king e8, bishop b4. And again, this cannot be captured because this time this king f2 move is a fork. So bishop g2 is played. Now king d4. And now this piece, could potentially be captured, but you're just losing way too much time. e6 is forced mate. So rook c6 is played instead. Rook a7, g6, rook e7 check, king d8, e6, rook c7, rook f7. And here, Aryan Tari resigns the game. It's actually like mate in 13 or something, according to Stockfish. It's just totally busted. Again, white's up a piece. It's a pretty nice idea here by Levon. So it went from very decent position, plenty of attacking chances, to bad to worse for Aryan Tari very, very quickly there. So I want to take a look back at those few critical moments where Levon Aronian really turned around this game. So I'm going to say this move h4 was a really nice idea by Levon. Of course, if black plays very, very accurately here, black is doing fine. You can't just refute the Marshall attack this easily. But this h4 idea gives this queen a little bit of space and really does slow down black's attack on the light squares. So keep an eye out for sort of strange-looking moves like h4. As long as you understand the downsides of these moves and make sure you have good responses to moves like bishop e2, moves like f5, moves like g5, then this move is sort of just playable and is just an improvement in white's position. After that, this idea of bishop d2 and knight e3 is a very nice reroute for white. White made his claim on the dark squares, that's where he's taking his stand, and then he breaks free by controlling a few light squares to activate his pieces, get the queens off the board, and then win the game. And from there, Aryan Tari sort of just collapses, and Levon Aronian is able to win a very nice game. Once again, a4, critical idea. See one set of rooks come off the board, then takes on b5, knight e3, queen h3, and the game is over. Levon Aronian sort of just crushing it here. By the way, Don't think you can get away with the move of g6, controlling this square. g4 traps your queen. By the way, side note, kind of important side note. Any questions on this game before we move on to a second one? Where did Tari go wrong? His position, I think, is technically fine until, let's see. Here, I think rook fe8 might be a bit of a misstep. I think here is sort of Aryan's last chance to go with a simple move like h6, keeping this rook back on f8 to defend this pawn and keep ideas of f5 alive. And yeah, a slow move like h6 I think is fine here for black in the position. To be honest, though, I'm not convinced I understand the position well enough to suggest meaningful improvements for black. I think this was just a very, very well played game by Levon Aronian. And it's tough when that happens. Also, some other ideas might just be to start chasing this queen around a little bit earlier and force white to go to some awkward square if he does want the game to continue. And then from here, maybe stuff like rook g6, maybe stuff like rook e8 here. And it's just going to be a game. Definitely, though, the last mistake, I should say, is this move bishop e4. This move is the losing move, quote unquote. I think, though, Aryan Tari's position is already pretty tough. Sorry, I think bishop f3, not bishop e4, is the losing move. Here, this idea of sacrificing this exchange, I think is perfectly reasonable still for black, and I think black is still in the game. Okay, let us move along. So, I hate to do it to the guy, but we're going to take another look at a game from Aryan Tari. This time, he had to go up against the world champion, his countryman, Magnus Carlsen. And like I said, it just hasn't been Aryan's tournament so far, and he's playing some really active, really interesting chess, but again, these world-class players, where they really, really excel compared to the world-class players of old, is their ability to defend positions, and that's exactly what happens here against Magnus Carlsen. But let's go ahead and take a look. We have Aryan playing e4, Magnus Carlsen going for the move c5, knight f3, knight c6, we get a Sicilian, d4, takes, knight f6 by Magnus, knight c3, d6, bishop g5 by white, bishop d7 by Magnus, and again, this is just some heavy Sicilian theory here. This is the Richter-Rauzer by the world champion, queen d2. And now a6 is definitely not the most common move by Magnus, just controlling the b5 square. We have queenside castles, and now e6 by Magnus. Now f4 comes on the board, and we are back in some very well-known, very well-known theory, I believe. Bishop e7, breaking the pin for Magnus. Knight back to f3 is the idea for Aryan Tari, regaining some control over the e5 square. b5 launches the counterattack on the queen side for Magnus. We have a take on f6, and now g takes f6, helps Magnus build a nice little fortress in the middle of the board. We see king b1, queen b6 getting active, and this is still, by the way, just some heavy theoretical opening stuff. I don't want to get too deep into it. f5, queenside castles, and the move bishop d3 by Aryan is sort of the first move that is not, the mainline stuff here. So, what is going on in this position? Well, we have a situation where black's position is very compact, but of course there is some airiness, some space around his king, and some threats of white breaking things open in the center of the board. So once again, it's going to be the high-rated player on the back foot in this case, trying to defend a position, but not necessarily, playing for a draw or anything, just trying to defend and wait for the right moment to sort of counter-strike, counter-punch, fight back. So in this case, Magnus plays a very simple improving move, king b8, and that's something that you'll see quite often in these positions with queenside castling. You just get the king off of the c-file and to a safer square on b8. Now the move knight e2 comes on the board by Aryan Tari. So What is Aryan planning? Well, it's pretty clear that he's trying to come to f4 and increase his pressure over the light squares in the black center. If he can force a move like e5, he'll be very, very happy when this knight is suddenly landing on the square d5. So how does Magnus respond to this? Well, he actually just plays the move bishop c8. He's keeping his position compact for the moment, keeping all his squares defended, and just allowing his pieces to breathe a little bit. Knight f4 comes on the board, and then a very nice defensive idea here for Magnus comes on the board. What do you guys think? What's this defensive idea for Magnus Carlsen? What to do? Yeah, it's still the Richter-Rauzer, even with a6 on the board. Even with a6. Although, I mean, sometimes I think you can transpose between openings in this case. Chess King says undeveloping in regards to bishop c8, I assume. No, I think it's redeveloping, more like, right? This bishop's important role is to defend e6, and it does that from the starting square on c8. And it's not undeveloping because the rooks are still connected, and in fact, it's sort of a developing move for the rook on d8. It allows it to examine this pawn on d6 a little bit. So yeah, what Magnus Carlsen is interested is actually a couple things here. Number one, he wants to break free on the d file with d5. You guys are exactly right. Number two, this idea of knight e5 is going to be really, really critical for black. With this setup, he has really good control over the e5 square, and he needs a central square for one of his pieces in order to fight back against this army that is sort of staring him down. So knight e5 is the move that Magnus plays. Now, of course, white is really not interested in allowing this structure when black would control sort of every central square very, very thoroughly and fight back or push back the white pieces. And so the move bishop e2 comes on the board. Now Magnus continues very naturally with the move d5. And I think practically this is a fantastic way of playing. This is, in a sense, kind of a pawn sacrifice, meaning that black is not going to be able to recapture on the d5 square, but the idea is not so much to get a big center. The idea is to allow black's pieces to breathe. That's what's really important in this position, and that's what Magnus Carlsen is going for here. Even if it looks like you are the one with less space on the defensive back foot, having less space doesn't actually matter unless your pieces are awkward. What do I mean by that? Well, the advantage of space comes in giving your opponent a cramped position, a position where they don't have enough room to effectively use their pieces. So if you can effectively use your pieces, it almost doesn't even matter how little space you have. So after d5, this bishop can come to c5. This bishop has ideas of coming to b7 at a future date. And all of black's pieces are going to be effectively in the game, so black's spatial disadvantage no longer matters. And this is a great idea when you are on the defensive back foot, the one with less space. If you can find jobs for your pieces, you should not be much worse at all. E takes d5, played by Aryan Tari, sort of the very natural idea here. And here, Magnus Carlsen takes on f5, which is maybe not the greatest move in the world, but it is kind of funny to see three f-pawns with the two knights, sort of hiding behind them here. And Magnus, for the moment, is regaining his pawn. Why isn't this move the best? Well, now knight d4 is eyeing some really crucial squares in the position for white, and also for black, of course. Bishop c5 comes on the board by Magnus. This was the idea of d5 to get the pieces into the game. Rook hf1, rook he8. Magnus, like I said, just trying to effectively utilize all of his pieces to sort of negate the space disadvantage. Aryan Tari plays the move a3 here. And now I would like you guys to try and find Magnus Carlsen's next move, right? You've sort of achieved what you set out to achieve with your d5 break. You got this bishop to c5. And now you need to go about trying to defend this position. I'm not going to lie to you here. Magnus has a pretty tough position in this case. I think he is a bit worse. But how do you play such a position? How do you play such a position? Let's find some ideas for Magnus. Yeah, Edward Lee in the chat says he's had quadrupled pawns before, but it didn't end well. Fair enough. I remember playing a game where there were, I think, 5 f-pawns, if you count both sides. I think white had doubled pawns on the f-file, and I was playing black, and I had tripled pawns on the f-file. It was a pretty fun game. Bobbert Collins says, Knight g7. I don't know if Bobbert has suggested a legal move yet tonight, but I wish him the best in finding one. Nightmare says b4. And yeah, b4 is a really good idea for black in many cases. Obviously, I don't think we should play it immediately, but this is going to be a nice idea. Not necessarily, you know, a traditionally defensive idea, but it's another one of those ideas where you're going for counterplay. And with counterplay, you can sort of change the story away from one of you playing a purely defensive passive role to one of you playing a more attacking role. So b4 is an idea to keep in mind, but I don't think we should do it just yet. Yeah, and Steve North has another great idea in Knight c4. These are really two critical ideas for black to gain some counterplay. Knight c4 is always going to be a threat that white is going to have to contend with, a threat that hits white's queen, threatens knight e3, and threatens sacrifices on the you know, quote-unquote queen side, where white's king is, all at once. Of course, this is another move that cannot quite be done immediately due to threats of knight c6, but these are two great ideas to keep in mind later in the game. Why isn't the black king safety in question? It is. That's why this is a lecture on defense. Yeah, knight g6 is headed in the wrong direction, unfortunately. This knight is probably black's best piece. This knight on e5 is very strongly placed, controlling many, many light squares and threatening jumps like knight c4. I'm not really interested in trying to trade this guy off. You know, meekly asking for trades is not always the best way to defend. So now that we see these two ideas for counterplay for black, that's how you can start to arrive at the next defensive moves that Magnus plays. If you don't see these ideas, Magnus's next moves probably make very, very little sense. But if you do see these ideas, then you might arrive at the move king a8, which is what Magnus plays in the game. What's the point of king a8? Well, Magnus is preparing for knight c4 with the opening of the b file, or b4, also with the opening of the b file in mind. It's also stepping out of knight c6 with check and allowing him a little bit more freedom to move these pieces around. So king a8, a great practical move in this case. Now Aryan starts doing some strange things. He plays the move h3, which I think is just way too slow here. I don't think h3 is going to be very relevant to the game, and to be honest with you, I still don't quite understand what his idea was, if it was just stopping knight g4, if it was, you know, considering some g4 move later on. I really don't understand this move, but that's what was played in the game. And Magnus's next move, while you know, the computer doesn't quite like it, I think practically it is perfect. He plays the move bishop back to d7, sort of a strange-looking maneuver if you are just thumbing through the game, right? You know, the bishop comes to d7, comes back to c8, comes back to d7. But, of course, the idea makes a ton of sense when you keep in mind Magnus's two moves for counterplay. He's preemptively over-defending the c6 square, preparing to launch his own counterattack against Aryan's king. And this is just great play, I think, practically from the world champion. And now, Aryan unfortunately makes the mistake that permanently loses the advantage for white. He goes knight h5, which again is a step in the wrong direction. He's trying to play against these tripled pawns that black has over here, but at the end of the day, he should have been trying to kill the guy with this weak king with so much space around it. So, chat, see if you guys can find, guys and girls, can find the best continuation here for white. How do you prove an advantage in this position? Yeah, maybe you can attribute h3 to some nerves. Trying to play a bit safe, but at the end of the day, if you give the world champion enough time, he's going to be able to come up with an idea. So there are a lot of ideas in the chat. I'm not sure I'm in love with bishop f3, because that does really increase the power of knight c4. This bishop is actually an important defensive piece for white. But yes, the idea is going to be pushing this pawn to d6 in some manner. You can either do it immediately, or you can start with a move like queen c3, but I like d6 immediately. Why is this move so strong? Well, because this pawn was actually sort of playing for black. It was keeping the knight out of d5, and once this pawn is no longer on d5, knight d5 is a really tough threat to meet for the world champion. Black would love to capture this pawn for free, but now this idea of queen c3 does come into play, and this rook is suddenly looking at the black queen. This bishop on c5 is no longer really so comfortable. Black can fight for some counterplay with the move b4, but after takes queen b3. Here it does just become very, very difficult for black to make moves. If you try to remove the queen from the file, bishop takes a6 is an idea with the loose bishop on b4. If you try to play bishop c8, white can start snagging some pawns. And here, black is going to have a tough time in this position. This is just a pretty bad position now for Magnus Carlsen. If the game were to continue, knight d5 is probably a really great idea to follow up with. Again, taking advantage of this loose piece over here. Something like bishop f5, even knight f to e3, and white is sort of just dominating the position. This king is going to be permanently weak, and if this knight ever moves, bishop f3 is going to be a great idea. For the moment, if this bishop were to land here, I think black would be happy to take it off the board. f6 is hanging, everything is just falling here for Magnus. So d6 is a really crucial attacking idea that Aryan Tari unfortunately missed in the game. Would have been a nice find here. Notably though, after takes, if you don't see this idea of queen c3, I think black is once again, starting to become better here. Queen c3 is a really important idea to find, and maybe this is what Aryan missed. In the game though, we do see knight h5, and now how to continue with black. White has played a bit slowly. Now is your chance to counterpunch, to break free from your slightly defensive, slightly passive position. See if you guys can find the point. What is the point here for Magnus Carlsen? So yeah, we already talked about the two ideas that Magnus has. One is knight c4, one is b4, and it's a question of deciding which one looks better. In this case, it is going to be knight c4 that is the more powerful move. White is essentially forced to capture this piece. If you don't capture this piece and move the queen, for example, rook e3, it's pretty bad. Queen back here, this piece is hanging, it's tough. So captures is forced, and this is what happens in the game. And here, Magnus has a good position, as we'll see. But why not b4? Well, it turns out white has a nice defensive idea here of, number one, just taking, number two, going knight to b3. If takes on a3, then, believe it or not, queen a5, and white is going to be in this game. Black kind of has to trade these queens off, and now with queens off the board, these f-pawns are going to start to be, felt a little bit more by black. These are going to be pretty key weaknesses in this endgame. I don't think black is much worse here at all. There's still play against the white king, even with queens off the board, but b4 would give white this opportunity to get rid of these queens before anything too terrible happens. Knight c4 played instead, bishop c4, bc4, and Aryan Tari tried the move queen to c3. Now though, rook b8 increases the pressure for black, the move king a8 coming in useful once again. Rook f3 was the move by Aryan, but unfortunately after this move, the game is sort of lost. See if you can find the stunning move that Magnus plays here to win the game. This move is a bit of a scorcher. Bit of a scorcher here. Not knight takes f6. Knight takes f6, unfortunately, is still defended. And yeah, Aryan Gutla has the answer. Maybe he's seen the game before, But, of course, the answer is rook e1. Maybe he found this himself, but I would be impressed. Rook e1 is a pretty incredible move. And this move does just win the game. It is not a sacrifice of a full rook, but just an exchange because this knight is a key defender. Well, this knight is under-defended. Both of the pieces that can take the rook on e1 defend the knight on d4, and that is Magnus's idea. Rook takes e1 was played in the game. Now bishop takes d4. Queen b4 is the only try now for white, and the stunning follow-up is actually queen c7, a retreating move that activates this rook, and from here on out, Magnus is just winning. d6 was tried by Aryan, but now queen c6, queen a5. Here, apparently the best was rook takes, but Magnus plays bishop takes, and this is good enough. King a2 to step out of the discovery, but now bishop back to e5. These threats are in the position, so rook b1 was played, takes, takes, and now Magnus just takes on d6. And the threats against this king are still here, and these two bishops are going to rake through the white position. King c1 was played, now queen d4 keeps up the pressure, with threats of now queen g1. Aryan took this pawn with check, but after king b8, believe it or not, there are no more checks, with black defending all of these squares. c3 is what Aryan Tari played, but now queen g1 check, and the end is near. Takes on g2, king e3, f4 check, knight takes f4, bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, queen g3 check, rook f3, queen e1 check, king d4, queen e5 check, king takes c4, queen e4 check, king c5, queen takes f3, king d6, bishop c8, and resigns, as Magnus Carlsen is now up a piece. Did Magnus see all that ahead of time? Maybe not, but he understood that the king should not really be surviving on b1 after this idea of rook e1, and he was correct in that sense. Black was always winning the game after this move, rook e1. Really, really impressive game here by Magnus Carlsen, I have to say. So what went wrong this game for Aryan Tari? Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look. Somewhere around here, I would argue that, especially after the move e takes f5, white has a pretty pleasant position, right? He has all these ideas in the center of the board, and black's pawns are looking a little bit sad over here on the f file. I think here knight d4 is perfectly fine, rook hf1 is fine, rook e8, a3 is even fine, trying to slow down ideas of b4. King a8, h3, I would argue, is just a mistake. h3 and then knight h5. And after two bad moves, the game is in Magnus Carlsen's control. So what should he be doing instead of h3 and knight h5? Let's try and come up with some ideas in this position. What can be done here? Why does white play a3? Let's think about it for a second. Why does white play a3? To be honest with you, a3 is one of those ideas that is sometimes good and many, many times bad, and it's so tough to tell the difference. I think in this case, the point is that after b4, a takes b4 is going to be a good response in many cases for white, because the idea of c3 to follow up with allows white to sort of take control over all these squares on the queen side. I think this is probably what Aryan Tari was going for. Yes, b4 still opens files for black, but white is able to take back control of many of these important squares after the move b4 is played. So I think this is why a3, and I think this isn't a bad idea, but it does sort of increase the power of knight c4, I should say, especially when after pawn takes, pawn c3 is going to be such a huge threat in every position now. So maybe a3 is a little committal, but I think it's fine. But what can Aryan do now instead of h3 and knight h5? Two moves which I think are very, very far beside the point. Noam says what went wrong was that he was playing against the world champion. Yeah, that's definitely part of the problem. Definitely part of the problem. Yeah, queen c7 is pretty tricky, says Harry, and I tend to agree. So yeah, again, this bishop f3 move isn't so good. These threats are definitely looming in the position. And at worst case, if black doesn't ever have knight c4, you know, taking this bishop isn't exactly a bad deal for black either. Stuff like bishop b7 to follow, and black can fight back on the light squares. So bishop h5 I don't really agree with. I don't think white should be going for play against these f-pawns here. I think white should be trying to resolve the situation on the queen side and going after the black king a little bit. I think this is where black is going to have the most success. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, I think this move b4 is actually well worth considering here for Aryan Tari. It sort of forces the issue with black's pieces. This bishop doesn't really want to retreat back to a square like f8 and sort of go back to being passive. So if black is forced to take here, white can then get the queens off, and in any sort of endgame position, these pawns are going to become very, very weak very, very quickly. And I think white is significantly better here. So I think b4 would have been a really clear-cut, practical way to continue the game. And if Magnus does play a move like bishop e7 or bishop f8, for example, I think white is just going to get a better version of the position that he did have, right? You can continue now with the move like queen to c3, and these ideas of knight c4 are sort of very much being dealt with. b4 is now an illegal move, so that idea is dealt with. a5 is hard to manufacture with a weak b-pawn, and I think white is, you know, getting a better grip on the position than he would have otherwise. So I really like this idea of b4 practically. Of course, there are many, many moves in the position that white can try, and most of them keep the advantage. But here, especially now after bishop d7, Aryan needed to find these moves in order to preserve his advantage. Okay, any questions on either of these games before we call it a day here? Any questions on either of these games? Yeah, kind of anonymous. It's less about going for trades and more about understanding that Magnus's threats are knight c4 and b4, and realizing that, you know, black doesn't really have the option of going for trades. It's not like you offer trades and then hope your opponent takes them. It's about using the fact that trades are good for you to force your opponent to play suboptimal moves like bishop f8. That's why b4 is so good. All right, no questions? Well then, the next lecture is starting momentarily. It is going to be on, as Chess King is saying in the chat, endgames from the Norway Chess tournament. There were some really, really interesting endgames, and I am very excited to walk you guys through them. There's some great technique being shown here at this tournament, and it is really nice, I should say, to find, to see all of these players doing what they do best over the board chess, the high-quality games that we have not seen for some time now. So hopefully you guys go check it out. The link is in the chat. If you're watching the video version, thank you so much for joining me. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.